About 5 years ago, an article appeared in a magazine called Scientific American. Some of you might read it. It's about smart people. It's called Bad News for the Highly Intelligent. Title I partly pirated for my title to the message from Luke 12 today. I call it Bad News for Smart People. The downside of being smart is not that you end up having to have hair like Albert Einstein. But the article summarizes findings from a study that was published in another magazine, a journal called Intelligence, where a researcher named Ruth Karpinski, along with her colleagues, released the results of a survey of Mensa's 134,000 members. You might know Mensa is that elite group of people with super high IQs who normally would be thought of as the most privileged and successful people in our society, and in many ways they are, but not in all ways. And that's what they were studying. What they discovered is that these highly intelligent people are much more likely to suffer from a range of serious disorders, mood disorders like depression and bipolar, anxiety disorders, attention deficit disorders, even environmental allergies, surprisingly. The research lays out some possible reasons for these disorders, but the most plausible explanation, at least the one that I could understand, was that very smart people tend to overanalyze and stew over things and even almost subconsciously conjecture more and more possible negative outcomes that can trigger the stress response in their bodies. And they also suggested that many high IQ people are stuck in a stuffy lab all day in a nerdy lab coat and don't get enough exercise or enough social interaction for a wholesome mental environment. That sort of makes some sense too. And of course, what they couldn't factor in was whether the smart people who'd actually want to join a society of smart people were not already afflicted with some mental imbalance. Anyway, there are lots of super smart people in this room, and many with doctorates, many with off-the-charts intelligence and various aptitudes requiring brain power that they don't necessarily test in school. But I bet not one of you feels any need to join Mensa, even at the modest $107 a year, as if you needed some sort of validation for your superiority. But what I will say in all seriousness is that you too might be suffering from the curse of high mental aptitudes in a way that could derail your life forever. My authority for that is Jesus, the smartest person that ever lived. Bad news for smart people. We're finishing chapter 10, which means we're halfway through the 24 chapters of Luke. This is the 51st message. We started end of September last year. Jesus turns to speak again to a surrounding multitude, as he did in verses 13 to 21. We're not exactly sure that all these sections in Luke 12 happened on the same occasion. But if so, these people have gotten quite an earful. They've evidently been listening in, at least those close enough to eavesdrop, even when Jesus is focusing in on his disciples. But I want you to resist the idea that all these people crowding around Jesus actually believe in him. Call them seekers if you want to, but we know that once the whole story shakes out, not many people are still in the adoring crowd once we get on the other side of the crucifixion. Jesus has just spoken about the division that manifests itself around Jesus. What he now explains to the crowd indicates that the coming division will be between those who have discerned the truth about Jesus and about the momentous opportunity it is to hear him and believe in him, and on the other side, those who have not appreciated what they're seeing, the amazing person that's right in front of them. And so Jesus reproaches them by calling them hypocrites. We're going to get to that, but let's just read the whole passage here for a minute. This is Luke chapter 12, beginning with verse 54. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you say at once, a shower is coming, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be a scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? And why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? As you go with your accuser before the magistrate, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer put you in prison. I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. And that word for penny is a word for the smallest coin they have. In fact, the word for it was the word that means thin. So we have the deal, one thin dime. Well, this is like an eighth of a cent. Jesus starts by complimenting them on their ability to forecast the weather. So we started with that in verse 54. When they see a cloud, see if I can make that come up. There we go. When they see a cloud rising in the west, from over the Mediterranean Sea, like Elijah's servant did, remember back in 1 Kings 18, they are quick to declare rain is coming. And lo and behold, they're right. Grab an umbrella. Bravo, aren't you smart, Jesus? I think he wants them, at least at the beginning, to admire themselves for their meteorological acuity. I just threw that out there because this is a sermon for smart people. Anyway. And then in verse 55, and also when they feel a south wind picking up, they are again correct to see what's coming, this time to assume that there's sweltering weather on the way, blowing in off those baking sands of the Arabian desert. And sure enough, they're right again. Grab the sunscreen, bravo, aren't you smart? Certain conditions always, or at least nearly always, lead to certain outcomes. So that's common sense. Actually, I've read that that hot wind that sweeps in can raise the temperature 30 degrees in just 1 hour. So when it's a question of weather, they're clever enough to draw good conclusions, and that would help them manage things like what you're going to be wearing, long sleeves, short sleeves, or what sort of work that you could be doing, whether it's in the rain or in the heat. Well, Jesus is not done because he's not giving them a lecture on weather. Verse 56, the tone changes dramatically. No sooner have they started feeling happy with what Jesus was saying than he turns on them with a denunciation. So they're feeling happy because Jesus is praising them for being clever. And of course, we all like that because it's nice to notice that at least one person doesn't think we're a complete idiot. But Jesus turns on them and he says, look, you're hypocrites. And then he follows with an accusatory question that explains why he would tag them with such a label, which is pretty much of a put down. And so they're very good at one thing, and then they fail to apply those same mental skills to something actually that's far more important. It's a serious inconsistency. You people are so knowledgeable, you're accurate in interpreting literally the face of the earth and sky, drawing wise conclusions, making wise adjustments. So good for you, but then how is it possible that you are so dense when you're faced with the need to interpret the present time? How can you ignore and misread the signs of the time? Now, what does Jesus mean by the present time? Well, actually, the word present is there. It's just the time, and it implies that this time right here. But it does sound a little big. Do you know the time? It certainly doesn't mean they can't read their wristwatch if they had one. Do you know the present time? You're going to check your what? What happened to my watch? Oh, I don't wear one anyway. But literally, it actually starts with the word this time. This time. Why do you not know how to evaluate and discern, seeing that you're so smart with the weather? Well, almost everybody reading this realizes that he's talking about this time. Here's you, here's me. This is a messianic moment where Jesus is walking among them, and this is their time to recognize him, to believe in him, or not. How they respond to Jesus is going to mean everything for any future blessing or judgment. And so it's like this, with Jesus in your midst, you smart people have something right in front of you, and then somehow you can't get a read on that. How can you miss it? How can you not see what God is doing in your midst? The signs that point, of course, to the significance and meaning of that present moment were multiple. Obviously, the miracles Jesus did, the way Jesus fulfilled prophecies, the way he talked and preached, the ministry of John the Baptist, introducing him. We're going to come back to those. Now, not all signs are easy to interpret. It's not like, so you should be able to figure out anything. A guy told me at church last Sunday that he took flowers to his wife shortly after they were married, and her response was, "Okay, what'd you do?" She didn't actually get the message that he had wanted. Or the man that went in to be treated for swollen ankles. They were working on that until they realized that he actually needed help with the 17 pounds of metal that he had swallowed that were sitting in his stomach. No wonder he had swollen ankles. Misdiagnosis is very possible. I was reading that it's estimated 40,000 people in America die every year from misdiagnosis. It wasn't that the crowd lacked the normal common sense intelligence to understand causes and effects. They had that in spades, but they evidently lacked the spiritual will to use their brain power, the sincerity of their heart, to do an honest analysis of Jesus. Wow, that same hypocrisy could be happening this morning with some of you. You may be as smart as a whip, although I don't know how smart a whip would be, but anyway, you have a good head on your shoulders. But you actually don't believe the Bible, you don't believe the claims of Jesus. And not because you necessarily have given careful attention to those claims and find them false, but that you have never taken the time or put any serious effort into considering the claims. This is what I would call intellectual suicide, because the risk of coming to the wrong conclusion is catastrophic. You may have picked up on some shallow criticism of the Bible or Jesus, and then you sort of casually let that be enough to settle it for you. Maybe you heard somewhere that the Gospel of Luke was actually a sort of a compilation or a reconstruction put together by church clerics, maybe in the 3rd century. Dogmatists picking and choosing stuff that would make an impressive story, but with no authentic authority over our souls, because it may not be true. Authority over our souls, that would be what we have in Luke, because there we have a truthful contemporary witness to the real Jesus. But if you've been told something else, you say, okay, I don't really want to believe the Bible anyway, so that's enough. Now, if that's you, maybe you need to, visit our bookstall and, up in the foyer, and I'll pick that up later. Can We Trust the Gospel? Sitting right out there. This is my copy. You can't have it, but Peter J. Williams. This is not a Bible-thumping goofball. This is, a PhD from Cambridge. What evidence is there that the events recorded in the Gospels actually happened? This is going to show you. But here's you, maybe a scientist or a researcher in some field who you've set up your whole career on being very empirical in your methodology, and you're well admired for your, by your peers for your objectivity and your brilliance. And yet, you have made decisions about the most precious thing in life, your very soul, without any serious, rigorous examination of the facts about Jesus. Is that not hypocrisy? Jesus says. Verse 57, Jesus has another why question. And why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? This is filled with astonishment, maybe even some heartbreak. Actually, a rebuke to people who ought to know better. You could check this out for yourself, but have you? Why don't you assess the present time correctly? It's perplexing. You don't have to be a rocket surgeon to understand these things. Just use your common sense. What excuse do you have for putting so little effort into this? And then in verse 58, he presses his point by pivoting to another area, common sense applied to legal matters. Something that climaxes in a stinky debtor's prison, where here he will underscore the peril of not repenting, of not getting right with God before it's too late. He gives an example of what a person with common sense would do, but lying behind the second illustration is their clear duty to reconcile themselves with God, as they naturally and sensibly would do with any human with whom they've been alienated, doing so before some unwanted, unbearable judgment could fall on them. So we're going to try to explain all this. He's not giving practical advice for when you have a legal dispute. What he's doing is sharing some common sense with that these people were not bothering to apply to their relationship with the great creditor and judge, God Almighty. An old preacher, his name was James Foote. This is early 1800s. He wrote, "It is a melancholy sight to see a man in any rank of life, melancholy just means sad, managing his temporal affairs with great shrewdness and success, but neglecting that one thing needful and allowing all his soul's affairs to go to ruin. And it is still more melancholy, a still more melancholy sight to see a man of genius and cultivated powers who can trace the history and philosophy of nature and of mind, and who can, let us not say guess the weather, but make solar and lunar observations and calculate a tide table and an eclipse, but who is yet practically ignorant of the God of nature and of grace. Back to the scene. Jesus paints this of a man who has wronged another, perhaps by withholding payment on a debt. Jesus is apparently inviting his listeners to identify with the debtor. You know, what if that were you? What would you do? And then Jesus is sort of like their conscience saying, okay, well, this is what you should do. You should use every means available to resolve this grievance before you get dragged in front of someone that could put you in great peril. Settle out of court, because the magistrate might pass you to the judge, and you don't want to take the chance that the judge will immediately, summarily incarcerate you, deliver you to the bailiff, who will fling you into a filthy cell and, in essence, throw away the key. And Jesus says, I'm telling you what someone should have been considering before ever getting into this horrible predicament, where they will never get out until they've paid the very last penny. Now, there's some parts we have to figure out here. So what is this really a picture of entirely? And not every part has to be, this is this, this is that. It's just when you get to the end, you realize you should have done something different. You should have settled before you ever got before the judge. These Jews all knew a judgment awaited them. Jesus merely points out what they must do before it's too late. Admit that you are guilty. Become reconciled to God now, before the judgment ever comes down on you. I mean, this is a solemn warning. This is a solemn warning to all of us. If you wait too long, then the judgment against you could be serious and prolonged. You will never get out of prison, not until you pay your debt in full to the very last penny. Now, that payback might theoretically be possible in this legal illustration, but even there it would be quite difficult, since a prisoner would make very little money, and it would be even less likely if the debt is large. But of course, our debt to God is infinite. And we know from elsewhere that punishment for rejecting the truth about Jesus involves eternal damnation. So what Jesus has said is that if they have wisdom to patch things up with an adversary on the way to the courtroom before any sentence is pronounced, much more should they see the best part of wisdom to seek peace with God before the opportunity for mercy and grace is past. Are you reconciled to God through faith in Jesus, the great debt payer? This is what Jesus was doing on the cross, paying the whole debt for sins of all who would believe in him. And if you are not reconciled to him in time, if you're not connected to his grace by faith in time, and what the Bible is teaching here is that you will face irrevocable suffering and you will never be able to pay off your debt. Hebrews 9, it is appointed to man once to die, and after this, the judgment. And so a chapter that began with warnings about avoiding the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, verse 1, ends with the hypocrisy of the multitudes who are smart enough for everyday life, but who are totally missing the prime indicators when it comes to eternal life. So now let me lay out some compelling indicators. So this is kind of just adding to this. All this is kind of getting, hopefully, to our brains and our hearts. Compelling indicators that explain this present time in Jesus, indicators that should have been obvious to all these people exactly who Jesus is. So we're going to talk about those, and then let me close by exploring why most people don't seem to find those compelling indicators compelling. I want to call that irrational reactions. So starting with compelling indicators. And so I ask it like this. What are some things about Jesus Christ that should logically make every person who ever hears about him follow him, love him, worship him, adore him, and exalt him as their highest priority with no rivals? We know that some people who watched Jesus would, they would search for reasons to openly reject him. Like what we had in chapter 11 when they accused Jesus of using satanic power to cast out a demon. That'd be one example of that. But if you go back to the beginning of Luke's gospel, which I just want you to think through, and I could put stuff on the screen here, it's just like we're leafing our way through our Bible. And what I want you to see is that Jesus is pretty impressive. Just turn the pages from one incident to the other. We've been going over this for over a year, looking for things that might make you want to vote for Jesus as king. So you might have questions about the coming election. We're just going to make this very simple. This is the election that matters. So here we go. First of all, there's an angel that appears to the young virgin. This is in Nazareth. This starts off the whole thing. We had some stuff about appearing to John the Baptist's father and all that. But where Jesus comes into it is this announcement to his mom. Mary, you're going to bear a son named Jesus. Mary, he'll be great. He'll be called the Son of the Most High. God will give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he's going to reign as king over a kingdom that will never end. And so now, if you're reading this and with your head screwed on correctly, you're going to want to and need to see how this story actually spills out. Was the angel lying? Will there be any indications that the boy is in fact extraordinary? Or was the angel appearance sort of a hoax? You don't know that yet. We'll get to chapter 2, so we have the birth itself. And that, that looks pretty normal, except it was born, he's conceived of a virgin. That was pretty abnormal, but whatever. But the birth itself, that's all are there. Except that, again, there are angels appearing, shouting, unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is Messiah, the Lord. So here is God being born as a human. Can anything be more impressive than that? But, when he's born, you could look at that baby, you wouldn't know it yet. And by the way, angels showing up is not something I see every day. When I was born, I don't think I even got storks. Well, then at the end of the chapter, we have Jesus as a boy of 12, and he's showing signs of being special by then. He's in Jerusalem, sitting in the temple among the best of the rabbinical scholars, sort of the Harvard guys of the time, with no anti-Semitic stuff at that point. But anyway, he's listening, and he's asking questions. And all who heard him, it says, were amazed at his understanding and answers. But look, this is the boy. He had not been in some, special program for exceptionally bright kids, the gifted kids. He's been in a hick town and with minimal school options. His stepfather, a carpenter, a builder, not some frustrated intellectual had to drop out. Now he's, homeschooling his kid to become, some intellectual giant. Not like that at all. Chapter 3, John the Baptist comes on the scene. He's the first prophet after 400 years. That ought to perk your brain up a little bit. He starts preaching and baptizing, and all along he's insisting he's not the big deal, that there's someone coming who is mightier and more worthy. And then we wonder, who would that be? We're told briefly that John the Baptist is so convinced of the truth in his preaching that he's willing to give up his life, loses his head, in fact. This is a preview of something coming later, but not. He doesn't lose his head before he has a chance to baptize Jesus. Now, do you think that when Jesus was baptized in chapter 3, and there it is, yeah, he gets baptized, and wait a minute, could that have been a fabrication? When the voice came from heaven, you are my beloved son, with you I'm well pleased. Did they have some stagehand dude crouched in the bulrushes with a bullhorn? Or did Jesus collude with John ahead of time? So when you baptize me, let's get a stunt dove to fly in and sort of land on my shoulder, and then Mickey over there in the bulrushes will pretend that he's God telling me how great I am. Do you suppose that Jesus was just some dude who had read the Old Testament prophecies, and then he just found out ways that he could play act the part of Messiah, sort of fake his way with trick miracles, stuff like stopping storms? Wait a minute. Well, that one would be hard. We could have used that technology during the hurricanes this last month. But that's actually what Jewish critic Hugh Schoenfield suggested. That's the book that fell on the floor, as it should have. The downfall of Hugh Schoenfield. Anyway, he wrote this when I was in college, and I read it, I think, when I was maybe a senior in college, and I have it marked up on every page. I'm just saying, what is that? You got to be kidding. But anyway, we could take a page out of this book, however, because of something that Schoenfield could not avoid seeing, that somehow dozens of messianic prophecies from the Old Testament were actually being fulfilled by Jesus with uncanny regularity, far beyond what could have ever happened by mere chance. So this was his attempt to say, how could that have happened unless Jesus actually was the Messiah? Well, Mr. Schoenfield, Jesus was the Messiah. And that's why all this happened. Why all these impressive coincidences of prophecies that somehow were fulfilled by this one man. And so then in chapter 4, Jesus begins his ministry. So he starts teaching from synagogue to synagogue, and that included the synagogue in his hometown, where he read from the prophet Isaiah, and he boldly claimed to be the Messiah Isaiah predicted would come. This is fulfilled in your ears this day, me. And when he spoke, the audience at first marveled at his words, good, solid, logical thinking on their part, until he spoke approvingly about ministry to Gentiles from the Old Testament. And that's when these bigoted people came unglued, got enraged, dragged him up a hill, and were going to throw him off the cliff. Now, you would think a pack of angry Jews would have no trouble doing that to Jesus, just one man against a mob. Although don't be fooled by the Jesus movies that usually cast Jesus as a skinny, undernourished, glassy-eyed, drugged-out guru type. Not a man who had spent the majority of his life doing manual labor. But anyway, Luke tells us he waded unarmed, unharmed, right through the crowd and went his way. Almost as if someday he might possibly be able to do that, walking on stormy waves. But right here, you begin to get a sense that he might be indestructible until his appointed time comes, his hour. Okay, so your eyes are they wide open at this point? I would hope so, because you don't want to miss how he begins to do works of power. All through the northern district, Galilee, he casts out a demon. He heals tons of people of all kinds of diseases just by touching them. No elaborate potions or incantations, no wild singing and dancing to produce some sort of hysteria so that people with psychosomatic ailments would succumb to it. Everywhere he's preaching the good news of God's kingdom. It is completely sober, good, and righteous. Chapter 5, he recruits some men to be with him that he can train to help him out, empower them. And they're with him constantly. So if he's some kind of charlatan, they're going to see it. I mean, he won't be able to hide it. And so when he tells people that he is meek and lowly of heart, his guys don't just start laughing, because they know him to be the soul of kindness and truthfulness. And eventually they will all give their lives in his honor, and to their dying breath insist on the complete truthfulness, authenticity of all his claims. Impressive. The people Jesus heals have major demonstrable ailments, like a leper or a paralyzed man who rolls up his mat and walks home. The people watching all knew these men and women. They knew that they were genuinely sick, and they knew they were genuinely well. You think some guy goes home to his wife after seeing such things, sits down at the table and says, Mrs. Asher, what was going on this afternoon? Do you know that Mr. Benjamin was walking? He walked home, all the way home. You mean that same Mr. Benjamin, the one who's been in bed for years? Yeah, same guy. He's walking now. And that boy, Issachar's kid, who's been deaf and dumb his whole life. I saw him in an animated conversation with his mom and dad. And she says, what? What happened? And then he just says, it was Jesus. Flip through more chapters of Christ's ministry, amazing preaching, the Beatitudes, revolutionary but beautiful. The call to love one's enemies, radical but beautiful. Is exactly what we want to hear. A call to amazing love. And then the warning to make sure people hear his words and do them, or they will be in serious trouble. And you might say, well, that's him being egotistical. Or he could ask it like this: does the combination of his power and compassion make it plausible that how you respond to Jesus actually could determine what happens to you eternally? Chapter 7, Jesus ruins a funeral, as in raises a dead boy whose widowed mother is in the procession following the coffin out of the village. It's her only son. Jesus stops the procession, tells the mother to stop weeping, puts his hand on the dead boy, and commands him to rise, which he does. Don't tell me this happens to all the funerals that you go to. And then Jesus gave him to his mother, and the people say a great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people, and they're on the right track. Now, these people are good at reading the cloud on the western sea and the south wind blowing from the desert. Are they any good at reading the signs right in front of them as they see a dead man get up and hug his astounded mom? Or have they recently seen other teachers come through town raising people? No, just one. Well, maybe they're all skeptics. You know, and a certain amount of skepticism is logical. Maybe even people with legitimate doubts then. After all, this is admittedly extraordinary to a mind-blowing degree. So you can hardly blame people for letting their mouths hang open while their brain is still spinning for a while. And I don't think there's any evidence that these Galileans were especially gullible. They sort of knew when someone was dead. Maybe even like John the Baptist, who sent messengers to Jesus because he's in prison and he's got doubts of his own. So he sends his guys, ask Jesus. And then Jesus sends them back with proofs. He said, go tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended in me. I'm doing all the things that Isaiah predicted the Messiah would do. Jesus makes a place for women in his ministry. It's impressive in a time when women were property and severely marginalized. Chapter 8, he tells parables for the first time, where it becomes evident that not everyone who follows him is going to carry through after testing. And then Jesus calms a fierce storm, and then he delivers a fierce man from fierce demons that have tormented him. And I could just keep on turning pages to so many incidents that we have already studied together. More healings, feeding thousands of people with just 5 loaves and 2 small fish. Warnings about losing your life if you try to save it. Plenty of straight teaching to let anyone know how you respond to Jesus is no casual thing. Not like whether you prefer Pepsi to Coke or Huskies to Cougars. Well, that may not be that trivial, but anyway. Jesus kept no secret about what was on the line, and it was very obvious that he wasn't just saying what everybody wanted to hear. He wasn't trying to build something that accrued to him. He wasn't collecting huge offerings so he could build a palace. He's pretty amazing. Now, I'm sort of going to stop there because, we could just keep on going. I think we're getting the idea that any objective observer at the time should have been hard-pressed not to become a committed follower of Jesus. Is there not enough, even in this abridged list of indicators, to convince us to follow him and love him and worship him, adore him and exalt him as our highest priority with no rivals? And we could keep building this list. We could go on with compelling indicators until we finally get to the most dazzling of them all, which, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And then we could spend the majority of this message on the first paragraph of Luke's 2nd volume, the book of Acts, where he tells how the resurrected Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples before he ascends to heaven, showing himself to them alive by many convincing proofs. But I want to leave time for the second question. Jesus used the word why twice. Why don't you know how to interpret the present time? And why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? And this is the heart of the passage. Why? Why and why not? So let's talk about irrational reactions. And I put this on the backdrop of the crucifixion, because this is the epitome of the insanity of man. And here's how we might expand on the why question. This is in your notes. How do we explain why the most obviously compelling and beautiful person that has ever been laid before the eyes of men could possibly be so unimpressive and so unconvincing to normally logical, even brilliant minds, such that the great majority of people who ever hear the gospel of Jesus refuse to bend their knees to him and confess Jesus as Lord, and can feel quite good about themselves for never doing so? And we could add to the why question. How could so many reject when full deliverance from all their sin and its punishment was offered over and over free of charge by the very one to whom their debt was owed? How could they possibly spurn him? Is it that those who don't become followers of Jesus are smarter than the gullible people who superstitiously grovel at his feet? Or is it possible the smart people who don't become Christians are dumber than those who do? Or is it neither? There's nothing new about this rejection, as if it's the product of the modern scientific age, where explanations of life no longer require the supposed invention of a God to provide safety from fears and answers to the mysteries that demand some sort of answer, even if it's a superstitious one. But we don't need that anymore. Well, then I want you to just go back, start with Adam and Eve, who were warned not to eat from the certain tree in that plentiful garden lest they die, and they did it anyway. Think about Noah preaching to his wicked generation for over 100 years as he was building the ark, warning them over and over, and they merely mocked him up to the very day that the rains began, and they were all swept away in the ensuing flood because they would not listen. Not one of them. Consider the ungrateful Israelites in the wilderness who had seen the mighty hand of God in the Exodus, delivering them from Egypt, and yet would not believe God could take them to the promised land. And so they died one by one in their tragically illogical unbelief, buried stiff-necked in the desert sand without ever setting a foot on their inheritance. Every one of that adult generation except Joshua and Caleb. This is nothing new. The new generation of Israelites that entered the land under Joshua, how did they do? Well, they too fail to honor God. They're consumed over and over with idolatry. And yet, God sends them prophet after prophet to plead with them, to turn back before it's too late, before a mighty swarm of Gentiles comes and takes over their sweet, holy land and kills them and deports them into exile and slavery, but they will not listen. And they decide just to kill the messengers. Those good prophets, God sent them in utter kindness. So comes around to the generation of Jesus. Will they watch Jesus and finally see God in grace and wonder? Certainly they will now, finally. Finally, he will send the Son. But no. Luke 13. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Behold, your house is forsaken. So the smart generation that could predict weather well enough saw all the compelling indicators so close, so up close and personal. But they were not willing. And so it is this generation of Jews who receive this ultimate prophet, Jesus, the Logos of God, who now are warned of a coming destruction that will culminate in AD 70 when Rome marches in, utterly destroys Jerusalem, and kills over 1 million Jews. But this warning falls on deaf ears. Luke 19. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you because you did not know the time of your visitation. There's that word time again. And the visitation is when Jesus came to them and they nailed him to a cross. Why? Why? Not stupidity. They're smart enough. It's sin. Because, see, we're all smart enough to understand the truth about Jesus once we see the data, but we're not humble enough to submit ourselves to it. And any desire is crippled by our selfish will. And it's true of us all. We can't see it because we don't want to. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We're the subject. That's the verb. We have gone astray. We have all turned to his own way. Ephesians 4 tattles on us when it describes lost Gentiles as those who are ignorant due to hardness of heart. Selfish sin blinds us and binds us, makes men, in fact, hate the light. You know John 3, right after John 3:16, a couple of verses later, 3 verses later, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. That's sin. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. So we love our sin and we don't want to give it up. The powers of our intellect are taken captive and compromised by our selfish desires, sinful desires. And this goes deep within our own nature. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly, foolishness to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerning. He does not have the Holy Spirit. So we're like less impressive specimens of the polymath Bertrand Russell. He lived a good long time, 98 years. He was still going at it when I was in college. But he was born in 1872. He was famous in his day for his diamond-sharp intellect. His powers of an analysis were so formidable that one friend called him the Day of Judgment. Russell once quoted, "I feel myself so rugged and ruthless and somewhat removed from the whole aesthetic side of life, a sort of logic machine, warranted to destroy any idea that is not very robust." And so he lived in a Christian England as a brash atheist. And in fact, in 1927, he gave his little speech titled, "Why I'm Not a Christian," a diatribe against Jesus and against organized Christendom, full of disdain, but I must say, falling far short of the sort of robust, detached logic he prided himself in. He ends his speech with high praise for what our human intelligence can create apart from God. And I read this full speech again this week, and I was again flabbergasted at the easy shots he took at Jesus, sophomoric logic, as if he, instead of Jesus, occupied the high ground when it came to truth and kindness and a sound mind. He adjudicated Jesus as being very unloving. When of all people, Jesus embodied love as no other, but he couldn't see it. And he is not unique, because he, like all sinners, are not free to follow the logical path to becoming a friend of Jesus without forsaking our favorite sins, which in his case were many, and in ours maybe even more. All his life, he was torn between atheism, his 4 wives, and many mistresses. This man who thought himself as a logic machine wrote this: "The root of the whole thing is loneliness." He's looking back on his long life. "I have a kind of physical loneliness which almost anybody can more or less relieve, but which would be only fully relieved by a wife and children. And beyond that, I have a very internal and terrible spiritual loneliness. I have dreamed of a combination of spiritual and physical companionship, and if I had the good fortune to find it, I could have become something better than I shall ever be." Now, I share all this because we should pity a man who dies full of unmet longings. For he, as all others of our species, had a God-shaped vacuum in his heart that nothing else could fill. But but he was not willing. Tragic. This could be you. All this prideful reluctance to look honestly at Jesus is what put Jesus on the cross. And the people mocked him as he suffered in public shame out of love for sinners like us. And I know that's something that's way in the past. But that same spirit of rejection might be right here in your heart. So here's the takeaway today. It is just a cry of urgency. Turn to look at Jesus before it's too late. You have an appointment with God, the God of all justice. Make things right with him while mercy is still available. Do you not want to meet him? To see him more than anything. To find out, could he possibly be as awesome as what his followers claim he was? What if there really were such a person who reveals every gleam of divine glory in full radiance, satisfies every longing of your heart, every thirst, every hunger, possesses every virtue and excellence that has ever been admired and respected, actually is someone who projects grandeur like a lion and meekness like a lamb, pours joy on everyone around him, speaks to wind and it either starts or stops, who commands earth, wind, and fire for blessing or judgment, is smarter and wiser than Solomon, who knows everything about you, and actually knows you and still loves you because he's a friend of sinners, bears the scars of love poured out, the marks of a mercy that exceeds all needs, that exhausts all language, that invites eternal praise and gratitude, suffers with willing patience the infinite agonies that may confer eternal comforts, can open the Father's hand, and there you are, sheltered where no one could pluck you out, is so rich in mercy and so full of glory that he pours satisfying grace on you forever and ever without running dry, is alive from the dead and lives forever to make intercession for you, sits on a throne and rules both heaven and earth in wisdom and justice and consuming compassion, who then invites you to sit at his table like an undeserving Mephibosheth at the table of King David, with you, your mouth hanging open, but asked to eat and enjoy forever and ever. And if you find someone better than this, go follow them. Go sing praises to them. Go invest your whole life in them. Go suffer for them. But if there's a Jesus like this, and what if there really is? Because there is, then this is the one that you submit to. Stand up and speak for, put up buildings for, live for, and die for, because he is your great reward. Nothing less than him. Let's pray. Lord, have mercy on us in our supposed smartness that can sometimes even make those of us that know you think that we can figure everything out without your help. We can apply this in so many ways to our hearts, but my prayer especially is that hearts that have never really turned to you in humility and need would do so today. So I appeal to you, Father, to help people see your Son, to see him as he really is, in his great glory and grace. This is my prayer. Amen.